Hello, and welcome to day 2 of the Sectigo Identity First Security Summit. My name is David Motti, Chief Strategy Officer and CISO Advisor for Sectigo. And today, in this session, I'm going to be talking about Zero Trust. Or actually, I'm not going to be talking about Zero Trust. No, wait, I am going to be talking about Zero Trust and the fact that we're all sick of it. But more seriously, I am going to define it. We're going to talk about really what it means. It's very important, but there's a lot of marketing hype and there's a lot of confusion that still exists around Zero Trust. There's some really, really cool things and important things that we need to take away from that, but not obsess about Zero Trust in and itself. What we need to focus on is, as what we say here, is on digital trust to really enable the digital world. So whether it be for things like the Metaverse or just your day-to-day business operations today, that's the more important thing that we need to focus on going forward. So without further ado, let's get started. And oh, by the way, if you have questions, feel free to just click the submit questions button and we will do our best to tackle those. All right, let's get started here. Everything today is digital business. Every organization has some kind of digital backend, or some of them are fully digital, like some of the banks that don't have any physical branches. They're just totally digital, or many other digital services that exist out there, or even landscapers that have iPads and cloud backends to help them manage their inventory of the bricks and mortar and all that stuff that they might actually have. And also with COVID, we certainly saw a massive rush to digitally transform. Right? Restaurants and bakeries and coffee shops all of a sudden had to do things like curbside pickup. How do you do curbside pickup with paper? It's very difficult. Many of these organizations invested in mobile apps and websites and hired on companies like Shopify and many, many others to help them build that digital business storefront. And I think many of them got a taste of digital business and they're not letting go. And so we are going to see that continue even more as we kind of propel through this decade. But with all of that, we need digital trust. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It is the cornerstone of digital business, or in other words, it's critical infrastructure. I think of it like the foundational element to digital business, because I can't go and buy a coffee or renew my passport if they don't know who they're dealing with. Are they dealing with David, or are they dealing with someone trying to pretend to be David? So there needs to be that digital trust. But furthermore, it's not just me and the human. It's the devices I'm using to connect to those services. We have to build trust in those. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to dissect that. So the first thing that we're going to at least double click on is Zero Trust. And, as a former analyst, I did many calls on Zero Trust. It's a really cool topic. It's a very, big topic. And I remember one tech titan I was working with, they said, hey, we surveyed some folks that we work with, and you could literally draw a line right down the middle. And there were about half that said we have Zero Trust projects or initiatives. The other half just said, we hate it. We hate the term. We might Google Zero Trust and just there's an endless list of articles and frameworks and things that we can look at. And so help us make sense of this and what we need to distill out of it, right? So it has some very powerful aspects to it, but certainly if you were to go to any exhibition, whether it's a physical event or virtual event, every vendor is saying that they do Zero Trust, but what do they actually mean, right? So we're going to talk about that, some of the core concepts and how it pertains to digital identity and digital trust as a whole. But the way how I think of digital trust Zero Trust, I should say, it needs to come part and parcel with digital trust. But Zero Trust as a whole, it's kind of nonsensical when you think about it. I mean, think about this person climbing a mountain. They obviously trust the person that's helping them up. I mean, talking about the person on the bottom trying to get up to the top, the person that's already on the top is helping them move up. they obviously trust them. They're giving them their hand. If they didn't trust them, they wouldn't do it. They'd try to climb on their own. And it's the same thing as we do business with each other. If I'm going to send you some of my Bitcoin or give you some of my cash, I'm trusting that whatever I'm doing that for, you're going to provide a service or product that I can use to fulfill whatever need I have. So there's always this notion of trust, and trust has to exist. So the naming of zero trust can be very confusing. And I've had a lot of conversations with many organizations that were kind of confused with the concept overall. So it's not really about having no trust in anything. We have to have trust. And a very simple case in point is if you're a bank, right? You have to do what's called KYC. Now, KYC effectively just means know your customer. And that means that you have to, if it's David coming onto the bank as a first time, I'm a stranger, you actually have to figure out who I am, convert me from a stranger to a known entity, and establish and maintain trust. Not zero trust. You have to establish and maintain trust with me because I'm your customer, because, oh, by the way, that's a regulation, KYC. So you have to do it. So that's really what we're aiming for here. So we're going to borrow from some concepts of zero trust, but remember to not obsess about the zero. We actually have to trust and verify and make sure we have that. So what does that look like more graphically and functionally, right? So the goal for all of us as organizations and security leaders is to establish and maintain that trust, whether it's with an employee that is a road warrior or they work from home, and you need to understand the device they use to connect with, the network they're coming from, and then them as a human, connecting them in and allowing them to access Office 365 or G Suite to access their work documents, right? But if we take the example of me, right, trying to connect to, let's just say, my enterprise. Well, we might first take a zero trust step, right? So zero trust is a good first step. And we're going to come back to this in a motion because I'm going to work through this as a life cycle. So the first thing you'll do is say, okay, this person is claiming to be David Mahdi. Let's have him prove that he's David Mahdi. So we're going to do what's called onboarding. And in the onboarding phase, maybe since I'm a human, you're going to ask me to snap my ID card, do something else to verify. Or if it's decentralized identity, which is another topic, I could use verified claims from my identity wallet and share those verified claims to help short circuit the onboarding process. But let's say this is totally vanilla. You don't know who I am, and I snap my driver's license. We check that it's David. We check all the elements in the driver's license, and we verify them. Then we go into that little area that you see here, which is established digital identity. And established digital identity could mean maybe an Active Directory, building an identity for David, putting him in a group, giving him a role, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a static element, but it builds who he is in the system. And then really on the right side of this circle, this authenticate and authorize and the day-to-day access, we can kind of clump into one thing. And that's where most of us live, right? When you've proofed yourself and you know who you are and you have your identity, on a day-to-day basis, as I access Sectigo content, as I access my banking stuff and other digital services I have, I'm not having to onboard every time. They already know who I am. I'm converted from a stranger to a known entity. But they're maybe passively using zero trust concepts in the background to ensure that let's, maybe have David authenticate using this token. Let's have David, we recognize his device, so we don't necessarily need to use his biometric on his Google Pixel 6 Pro, right? We could just go ahead and let him in. So there's all these different weights and balances and policies that we can control. Microsoft would call that conditional access, looking at conditions while you're throughout. But that's where we're going to spend the bulk of the time. But inevitably, the user is going to have to move to that next phase of recover or renew. Or if we borrow from identity and access management vernacular, mover, or I should say joiner, mover, leaver, right? So if I'm leaving, I would just be deprovisioned, as you see at the bottom of the slide. So it's like, I'm done, I'm deleting my account, I'm out of here, right? So you could just deprovision me. Okay, fine, we've checked that use case off. The next one would be renewal. And renewal could also be me moving in the organization. Or unfortunately, I lose my device or I drop my phone and it falls in water. And I mean, it would be okay for a bit, but maybe a steamroller ran over it and it is totally useless. How do I get access to my accounts if my primary method was using this mobile device here? How do I actually get in? So we need to use some other methods. Maybe you could ask me to use my Titan key, which, by the way, public service announcement, I would recommend getting one of these tokens. I have a bunch of them. I keep them on my car keychain, and I don't really use them that often, but I have used them when I've lost access to accounts. It's a very quick and easy way to get access, especially when you don't have one of these devices handy to get into things. But users here will have to do something to reset and renew, and that's that middle line right there. And that's where zero trust can come in to be a very powerful concept in this use case, because we can say, okay, this is a bit of a strange situation. We need to onboard that user again. We don't need to go as deep into onboarding David because we kind of already know who he is, but we could maybe use other devices that he has to validate him and let him in. So this is visually what it is. And actually, if we were to take another view of this, we'd have zero trust kind of all in the background of this slide, acting whenever there's a situation that looks weird. So we need to know, David's devices he's using, his applications, and maybe even behaviors. And if anything falls out of line, we can change, add him to authenticate or get him to authenticate or do other things. But what are we implying here? We're implying that digital trust is not static. By no means can you say no trust at all. So like if you were to take zero trust as it is as a term, no, it's nonsensical. You actually have to have trust. But if you do trust David because you've authenticated him, you can't rely on that trust being the same all the way through. In fact, if I authenticate once at the beginning at the door, because of things like Trojans that would sit on your desktop that could be dormant and then see that I go to a banking website and turn on and then start to do damage, you have to look at David's behavior overall, especially if someone's stolen my credentials and they're trying to use my identity to further penetrate the organization. So we can't rely on the fact that trust is a static term. Right? That's where zero trust actually does come in to be powerful, because it's more this trust but verify. So sure, David logged in once. That was totally cool. He used his device. That looks normal to us. But if something weird happens, like David's based in Canada, but he's doing a transaction from Singapore at the same time, let's stop that. Right? And let's actually send him a push notification or get him to present a biometric or do something else to authenticate him, to validate that that transaction was coming from him or not coming from him. So we can lose trust at any time, right? So again, the goal is always to establish and maintain that trust. And so that was the notion of maintaining trust. Use zero trust concepts, but by no means by no means say zero trust is the end goal. Zero trust is just an approach there. All right, so let's press ahead. Now, if I translate back from zero trust to digital trust as a whole, and frankly, digital trust and what we're trying to show in this slide is frankly everything. In my view, digital trust is the parent of cybersecurity, right? You don't have to take my word for it. A few years ago, Gartner published a special report on digital trust. I think maybe 3-4 years ago. It was led by Ant Allen and Felix Gatkins. Very good report defining digital trust. And I would actually say we should probably dust that off and take a look at it now, because as we start to go more into the future, everything is starting to become about digital trust. So that was an interesting special report that was written many years ago. PwC, they have a yearly report that they publish on cybersecurity and cybersecurity breaches. Well, they rebranded it, renamed it, if you will, to a report on digital trust. Because again, security is actually all about trust, right? If something gets breached, you can't trust it anymore. If something has authenticated and is using everything up to date, up to par, its patch levels, everything, then you can trust it. So at the end of the day, the goal of cybersecurity is to establish and maintain trust with all of the entities you work with, humans and machines. So code, applications, devices, you name it. So the goal is actually digital trust. And World Economic Forum has a group where there's tech titans and others that are involved in setting guidance and so on for digital trust. So they have a group on digital trust. Same with Deloitte. And then MITRE got together with NIST to work on this great report, which came out, I think, back in January, on engineering trustworthy, secure systems. This is almost a direct response to some of the issues that we've seen with supply chain attacks, right? So maybe I don't need to penetrate your organization, but I could find out what software and services you're using. And if I find vulnerabilities with common software and services or even hardware, and I can get into their supply chain and get my stuff embedded in those products, then I already have an entry point into your network. And so what NIST was doing here is saying it's all about engineering trust in these systems so that you can deploy these devices, these software, the operational technology, IoT, you name it, traditional computers, and you have trust that if it generated a key on that mobile device, you could trust that key, right? So that's the whole notion. So keep an eye on that because you're going to start to see the vernacular change. Cybersecurity is still going to be a popular term, but in my view, the framing of it, especially for a lot of folks that are looking at the overall business, you should start thinking more about digital trust versus just cybersecurity as a whole. So let's get into some of the specifics just a little bit. And we don't have a lot of time to drill into it, but many of the topics we'll be covering at the Sectigo Summit will cover some of these things. But from a high level, how then, David, do you build trust in these systems, in humans and machines? Really, at the end of the day, the front line of digital trust is in the humans and, frankly, the devices that they're using. Because while it is David, again, I'm going to hold up my mobile device. This is my conduit to maybe how I access some of my services. So my services not only need to trust me, but they have to trust my device, the software that's on it, the state that it's in, and then also me as a user. So it actually is a harmony of humans and machines that is the core important point. And we're going to dissect that as we talk about establishing and maintaining trust. But as a way of framing, this is kind of the way how I like to talk about the stack of digital trust. Everything is digital business. We talked about that. And what comes under that is digital trust. Every digital business needs digital trust. Otherwise, you can't transact funds. I can't ship you goods or vice versa, or I can't offer you these powerful services. And what's needed with digital trust is digital identity, or digital identities, I should say, identities in humans and in machines and things. So humans, of course, the users accessing it, the physical people. Applications. I mean, if you have an iPhone or an iPad and you download an app from Apple's App Store, those apps are digitally signed and they're authenticated on your device before you download it. And so your device is making sure like this came from Apple. So in a way, it's like application identity, right? Cloud. Microsoft went out and bought CloudKnox, a vendor, last year in the space of cloud infrastructure entitlements management, because they recognize that there's actually a lot of identity stuff that has to do with cloud environments and workloads. Some of these workloads relate to humans, and some of them are purely just machines. And so if you have multiple containers, you have container one and container two, and they're kind of doing the same things, but maybe they're working on different data sets, and container one does something, and you want non-repudiation or a log, a record, a strong cryptographically bound record, you're going to need a digital identity that's rooted in cryptography, which we'll talk about in a second. Devices. I mean, this device right here, as well as many Apple devices and Windows devices with the Pluton chipsets, all of them are putting a lot of this stuff front and center. So these things having identities as well. So you know that David is using this device, and we can prove that because this device has an identity, and using this application, that application has an identity. So you can see very easily it can actually explode exponentially when you think about all these identities interacting with each other. Again, harmony of humans and machines. The next piece is data, right? So we need to have that trust in our data itself, whether it's structured, unstructured, or semi-structured. And this could be things like document signing, code signing to an extent. What's interesting is I was talking to another industry analyst, Simon Mott, at the Cyber Hut, and we were talking about The notion, the trifecta, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability of cybersecurity. And we both agreed that while confidentiality, like, AKA encryption, privacy preserving methods, all of that stuff is important, integrity is starting to take a front seat. And what we mean by integrity is, again, if you go back to NIST talking about engineering trustworthy systems, ensuring that there's integrity of your software, integrity of your data and your documents. And the way to do that, I go into the next bucket, it's all rooted in cryptography. So how do we bring digital trust in the digital world? It's actually through crypto. Right? So whether it's using symmetric keys, asymmetric keys like PKI, or even secrets that are there as well, SSH, all of these things, it's crypto that is actually the lifeblood of our digital world. And so the way how I see it really is that cryptography is like the concrete and steel foundation of our digital world. And we need to get it right. And we need to make sure that we respect that, and we're dealing with it with all these humans and machines. So let's dissect that a little bit further as we go through here. So it's so critical that in NIST Zero Trust Architecture 800-207, if you want to take that one for a read, it's quite long, but it's really good report on zero trust and really lasers in. But I'll cut to the chase here a little bit. This is a snapshot from that very same report, and we've just prettied it up a little bit so that it looks good in the slide. But there's all of these different elements that come into play with zero trust. And again, always think about that identity lifecycle. And that identity lifecycle, the lines that I showed you before, can apply to a human or a machine, right? And they should. Now, the thing that we want to draw attention to is really the PKI and ID management being such a critical part that NIST called these out on their own. So let's actually take a look at that. And again, if you want to dive in further to that, I would say take a read of that NIST report. But in the one 800-207, why is it that they called out identity management, or IAM, and PKI as being so critical, right? Again, if we link it to zero trust and link that to digital trust, right? Why are they so critical? I think you kind of know the answer, but again, it's because of their ability to bring in that trust to digital business as a whole, but trust in the identities, trust in the data. And so if things are using strong cryptographic backends, right? Some of them might be more explicit than others. Some of the software and services has the cryptography built in, and it's already doing that automatically for you. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But the idea is that that's what you should be demanding. Everything should have a strong crypto backend, and the crypto itself also needs to be watched and monitored, because the crypto itself can fail in many ways, or with the looming threat of post-quantum, we need to think about that as well. And Jason Sirocco will be talking about crypto agility and post-quantum and these topics. But here we're just showing the framing of where all this stuff fits. And what's more important, I would say, about this that I'd like to highlight is that cryptography, I've been in this space over 20 years, and cryptography has always been an esoteric area. Okay, fine. Not everybody needs to be a crypto expert, but everybody needs to start recognizing that this is the concrete and steel foundation. And if this fails on you, your mobile apps will fail. Your website will not be accessible. Your IoT devices might just stop in the field and not send you any sensor information. That is mission critical, I would think, right? For sure it is. So all of that, we need to make sure we get the crypto right. Now, thinking about digital identity, right? A big part right after I showed digital trust, there's a big part with humans. Now, I can say, having been one of the lead Gartner analysts for IAM, covering authentication, covering decentralized identity, bring your own identity, and a raft of other topics, that a lot of the IAM market, identity and access management, was focused on humans. And look, markets and Gartner have a figure around 25 billion by 2025, and that's the traditional access management. Vendors like Okta and others, privilege account management. So when you think of CyberArk and Beyond Trust, or even cloud infrastructure entitlements management like CloudKnox, now Microsoft, and many others that are in the space that play with that, Sonray and others. Identity governance and administration, SailPoint and IBM and others that are in that space. And of course, user authentication. But again, these are all focused on humans. Could a piece of software use a biometric itself to prove that, maybe that bot that's a piece of software could show its fingerprint? No, it doesn't have any fingerprints. Could it use a token like this? No, it can't, because it's a piece of software. And that piece of software needs an identity, it needs to authenticate. So we can borrow from some concepts, but we need to start thinking broader than humans. Workloads and all these things needs identity too. And as I mentioned, there needs to be a harmony between the two things. Gartner, for example, has been talking for years about artificial intelligence. Not it's solving everything on its own. You need a human in the driver's seat, right? And that human needs to interact with them. So it is actually a harmony between the identities of the workloads, of the machines, and the humans working together. And they need to have that supply chain with engineered trust built in. And the only way to do that today is with cryptography. And we'll dissect that a bit. But first, what are machine identities? Very quick, I alluded to them in the beginning of the presentation. They're IoT devices, OT devices, mobile devices, laptops, desktops, software and applications, or kind of what's more emerging, robotic process automation, or RPA. They're these bots that act like people. Some of them are supervised, some of them are unsupervised, and they can go in your environment and do things. They will need identities. They will need to digitally sign things. They will need non-repudiation to say, oh, something broke. Who broke it? Oh, that bot that represents David broke it. It wasn't David, but we know it was that bot because it was signed, and we have that non-repudiation. Right? So it's very, very important that we understand these concepts, because these machines are already here in your environment. So where does PKI fit in when we talk about PKI in general, right? PKI, you can slap it in here as this other layer, because PKI is the foundation, and other symmetric keys as well, for digital identity and for data. You think about encryption, you think about authentication, right? When people talk about moving to passwordless, what is at the forefront of passwordless? Well, built-in PKI. Things like Fast Identity Online or FIDO is actually a kind of a custom PKI for authentication. But that's just scratching the surface. And so what was funny for me, being a Gartner analyst for 6+ years, when I joined last decade, Gartner, and many other analysts saw that I was covering PKI, there was always this running joke of every year is the year of PKI. And so I'm going to sit here and say 2022 is the year of PKI. Actually, you know what I would say? It's the decade of PKI, because we have now more and more use cases which support PKI as that foundational structure. But PKI is not a technology in and itself, and it's not a solution, more importantly. It's not a technology that can map to a solution. You have to actually build things on top of it to make it useful. And we're going to talk about that. Right? So, but before we do, fun fact, did you know that blockchain and Web3, it uses PKI? When I started doing some of the foundational research at Gartner, one of the things that gave me a quick path to understand blockchain, and I did do some blockchain work before I joined Gartner, was the fact that I knew PKI. And really, it's a decentralized PKI. So when you get into identity and all these other things, it's a decentralized PKI. So anyway, just a side fact, but an important note that even as we talk about this, it's really that. So one of the things that you've seen at the conference is, probably the DeLorean. And for some of you that are familiar with Back to the Future, I just wanted to highlight Marty and the Doc being in the DeLorean. And why am I bringing this up? I'm crazy, but I'm not that crazy. I do have some method to my madness. It's, if we look at the slide, let's go back to the past like Marty did in the first Back to the Future. And we can look at things back then and bring them to the future, go back to the future, and that's PKI. And what we're showing here is these horizontal slices are the use cases. And PKI has always been one of those things, and trust me, I know, I've been in the space for a long time, that it was just a tool looking for a problem. And there were some clients out there that solved some big problems with PKI, but the reality is we need to focus on business outcomes. Now, these are use cases PKI can support. Some products and services will have PKI built in. Others might need explicit private public CAs to connect into these. So the reality is that customers don't really care so much about the PKI in and itself. They care about the business outcomes. And that's what this is leading more towards. But it means that as we rely on this stuff more and more for digital business, which we will, They need to be managed and respected. So that's why we put at the bottom cryptography orchestration, automation, and response, because things aren't going to run perfectly. Things will fail. So if they fail, you have to manage it and deal with those things. But the point is that we're past the point of no return with cryptography being intimately connected with digital business. And the organizations that recognize that, sooner the better. All right, now I'm not going to go over this because we have many sessions this week that will talk about all the things that we're doing at Sectigo. But just a very quick thing to note here. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see all the stuff that's going on with Sectigo. You see all the things we integrate with, what we focus on, and all of that. You know, the market really has been in need for a massive change. Now, one, a lot of the vendors in the space needed these use cases to really be there and to support businesses. But as I was showing in the other slide and I alluded to, it's all about business outcomes. I mean, the reality is I have a YubiKey here. As much as I like using these, I don't want to. You just want to be able to show up and access things. And so what happens to a lot of vendors is they get obsessed about what's going on behind the scenes, as they should. But when they lose sight of what the outcome is that the customer needs. Customer needs to run a digital business and they need digital trust, meaning that they want to trust everything, right? Even as I mentioned, the cybersecurity cybersecurity is actually under digital trust, because what a bank needs, or David's DeLorean shop, what I need is just to run my digital business and have trust in my customers and trust in the software and services that I use. That's it. If I have to employ cybersecurity to maintain and establish that trust, fine, I'll do so. But that's not, we have to think about the means to the end here. And so what we're doing here at Sectigo is manic focus on the outcomes that many of you are trying to achieve, while we take away a lot of the heavy lifting with lifecycle management and certificates. Because for too long, the certificate authorities were just focused on just issuing certs and not really managing them properly. And I think that was a big fault of them, for sure. And then CLMs came, and there's some good vendors out there, but many of those CLMs, that's all they do, right? At the end of the day, the customers just want the business outcomes and they don't care. So really what we're looking at is consolidating all this to help customers reduce complexity in their environments and drive this forward. All right, let's wrap up here, and then I think we'll call that a session. So really, to conclude very quickly, is that start to think about digital trust as that overarching theme that cybersecurity fits under, because that's really what the business is focused on, right? And when you think about zero trust, it's important, but remember, the goal is to establish and maintain trust using a zero trust kind of in the background, like Microsoft would call it conditional access and so on and so forth. Digital trust also requires harmony between humans and machines. No, it's not just machine identity, and no, it's not just human identity. The two need to come together. So there's the whole pitch of openness and interoperability that weaves in here a little bit as well, which I talked about yesterday. And PKI and cryptography really rising to the occasion nowadays. And whether it's driven out of a cloud, whether it's baked into your products, or it's a private on-prem CA, all of these things need care, management, and orchestration, because the future is going to be ever more rooted in cryptography, and you need to get ahead of that now. So with that, I want to thank you for joining the session. If you had questions, make sure you put them in the Ask Questions box below, and I will say enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you.